Okay, so this is about my going through, you know, from woe to go. So I left school, and my father was an architect, and he said, "You've got to be an architect." I said, "Don't think so," because some of the buildings he built around Doncaster, where we grew up, they're so frickin' boring. And I said, "I'm not going to do that." So why don't you come down the front here, Martin? You might be able to hear better. You're okay? All right. So anyway, I went and did civil engineering at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. I always loved aeroplanes. My dad was a pilot in the war, bomber pilot out of Papua New Guinea. And we used to go down to Moorabbin Airport, and we used to watch the Air Force shows, and I just loved it. So I thought, once I became a trainee engineer, earning a bit of money, I thought, damn it, I'm going to go and learn to fly. So I got a bit of help from the government, and where do we go? How do we get? Oh, there we go. That one. And so I went down to Moorabbin Airport. How do I get the pictures up?
No, just click your arrow at the bottom. The right.
Which one?
Just that left.
Down here.
That one.
Ah.
Put your cursor on that and go right.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I just fired jumbo jets. I can't work this. Anyway, right. Oh, now that bloody thing's just... Righto, getting there.
Right arrow.
Yeah, I'm on the... Hit the right arrow. There we go. So I started learning to fly, and it was called the Victor Air Tour. Victor Lawnmower Company made them. And a New Zealand company bought out the aircraft side of it, and now they call them a CT4, and the New Zealand Air Force use them to train pilots. They're a wonderful training aeroplane. And in New Zealand, they beefed up the engine, a much bigger engine, and they, you know, tarted it up, and it's a really good aeroplane. Anyway, that's what I learned to fly in. I got my private license in that, and then I had to get hours up to get a commercial license. So I got all my mates, and we used to rent a Beechcraft Bonanza or a Cessna 206, and we'd hoon all over Australia in it, and they paid to get my hours up. And finally I got a commercial license, and then I had to get a job. So I hunted for a job all around Moorabbin Airport, Essendon Airport, all over the place, and nobody had a job for somebody with only 220 hours. And somebody said to me, "Look, why don't you try Papua New Guinea, because they have, they're always after pilots, because the ones that are up there kill themselves in the hills." And I thought, oh, yeah, okay. So I saved up my money, and I went up to Papua New Guinea. And I canvassed all the little airlines around the place, the charter companies, and nobody wanted somebody with 220 hours. So I was a bit despondent, but then there's a company called Aerial Tours, and they had a bunch of British Norman Islanders. And they said, "Look, we can give you a job at Daru as a traffic officer." And I said, "Oh, right, I'll take it. Where's Daru?" And they said, "Well, it's the most mosquito and crocodile infested island in PNG at the mouth of the Fly River." I said, "Oh, that's terrific." So I said, "Right, and what's the traffic officer do?" They said, "They take money, sell tickets, and do a weekly return." I said, "Oh, right, is that easy?" And they said, "Yeah, anybody can do it." Anyway, so next day off I go down to Daru on the TAA Twin Otter, and sure enough it's crocodile infested and mosquitoes everywhere. And I met the pilot, the resident pilot there, who's now still a mate of mine, and he showed me the mess where we sleep, and then he showed me the Daru club where you drink, and then he showed me the office at the airport. It was a tin shed, and it was hot as hell, and we opened the door, and the typewriter had a wasp nest in it. So we said, "Oh, this is nice. Is there an air conditioner?" No, but they got a fan. Anyway, he had this bag, and he said, "There you go, there's your work." And I said, "What's in it?" And he said, "Well, don't open it quickly, because there's a wasp nest in there too." So we got rid of the wasps, and the bag was full of money, cheques, airline ticket stubs, airline tickets, all sorts of stuff. We tipped it up, and I said, "What am I supposed to do with that?" And he said, "Oh, you've got to sort it out and make weekly reports. There's been nobody here for 3 months." And I said, "Well, who sold the tickets?" And he said, "I did." I said, "Why didn't you do a weekly report?" He said, "I didn't know how." And I thought, "Oh, geez, neither do I." Anyway, I fought with this money for about 2 days, and then I thought, this is stupid. So I put the money in the bag again and I sent it up to Port Moresby. 2 days later, one of the Moresby people from the office came down with the bag again, and he said, Dennis Douglas owned this company. He said, Dennis not too happy with you and he's going to sack you. And I thought, oh, that's hardly fair. I said, I don't know how to do a weekly return. And he said, yeah, well, yeah. He said, Dennis sacks everybody. Don't be too sensitive about it. And I thought, and I said, I've never been sacked in my life. Mind you, I'd only had one job in my life. And he said, well, you could resign. I said, well, yeah, I'd rather do that. So I signed this bit of paper and he said, no, you resigned, you're out of here. And I said, oh, great. What about my pay? And he said, oh, yeah, I asked Dennis about that. And he said, look, it's been 6 days, he's not going to pay you. And I said, oh. So at the Daru Club that night, talking to the resident pilot, Bob, and he said, look, why don't you go down to the tin shed tonight after dark, take the torch and the parrot, because there was a parrot in the nest, so I took the parrot, and it's a sulphur-crested cockatoo. And he said, go down there, and he said, write yourself a ticket to Melbourne on TAA and charge it to Aerial Tours. And I said, how am I going to get away with that? And he said, they won't know for weeks after. So I said, okay. So I went down there and I wrote this ticket from from Daru to Port Moresby on the Twin Otter, and from there 727 to Melbourne. And on the ticket it had class, and back then they didn't have business class. They had economy or first. So being a bit reckless, I ticked first class. So anyway, next day, I'm a bit of a nervous wreck. I go up to Port Moresby with my ticket and my bag, and I go to the TAA check-in desk, and I said, look, I don't have a booking on the flight, but I need to get to Melbourne. And she said, oh, let me check. She said, let's have you oh, Mr. Wake, oh, you're first class. Oh. She said, I'll put you in 1A. And I said, oh, great. And so she checked me in. And so while I waited, she said, the flights aren't in, because Ansett and TA used to all rock in together. You know, they called it a 2-airline policy. It was actually twin airline policy. And so I went up to the Gateway Hotel that overlooked the airport, had a beer, a bit nervous. I thought the cops are going to get me for sure. And then finally I see the two 727s come in. Passengers got off, and I waited and I thought, oh, I'm not going to get away with this. And then I see passengers getting on. So I go down there and I go through immigration and I go up the steps, and the hostess says, oh, hello, Mr. Wake, sit down. Would you like a beer, champagne or an orange juice? And I said, no, nothing, thanks. She said, you look a bit nervous. And I said, yeah, I am a bit. And she said, well, look, everything, it's fine. We've been doing these flights for years. We haven't lost one yet. I said, oh, that's good. Anyway, so I'm sitting there and the passengers are getting on, and then the last passenger got on, then the traffic officer got on with the paperwork, goes in the cockpit, comes back out, and then they shut the door, and I said, whoa, where's me champagne? And so off we go. We go to Brisbane, no cops. Sydney, no cops. Melbourne, no cops. And so I had to take a taxi home with the very last pennies that I had, knock on the door of my parents' house, and they said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, New Guinea didn't work out. And they said, you're back here? And I said, yeah. And they said, oh, bugger. Anyway, so I stayed there for a while, and I went down to Moorabbin Airport looking for a job. Couldn't get one, of course. And they said, why don't you go to Lilydale Airport? And Lilydale Airport belongs to the Civil Flying School where I'd learnt to fly. They said, there's a guy leaving and they're going to need another instructor. Do you have an instructor rating? I said, no. And so I went out to Lilydale, and the CFI was a mate of mine. And I said, look, Pete's leaving. Can I get his job? And he said, if you can get an instructor rating in 4 weeks, yes. I said, right, let's go. So I borrowed money from my grandmother to pay for it, and I got my instructor rating. And from there on, I'm flying around with this little flying school at Lilydale. It was fantastic. And then while I was there, I got myself a twin engine rating and an instrument rating. So I'm getting more qualified. The hours are building up, and it was terrific. And I applied to Qantas, Ansett and TAA. And TAA interviewed me, and they said, right, I went through their interviews and their process, and they said, okay, we can give you a job, but we deferred the intake because things have slowed down, and it might be 2 to 3 months before we actually take you on board. And I said, that's fine. So I'm back to Lilydale, and then we get the Australian newspaper one day, and it's got this one big page ad, and it's an Air New Guinea task force recruiting pilots for Air New Guinea, a brand new airline owned by the Papua New Guinea government, Ansett, TAA and Qantas. They all in together. And TAA was responsible for training pilots, and I thought, oh, let's have a go at that. So I applied for that, went for the interview, got the job. And they said, what am I going to be doing? They said, well, you'll be flying a DC-3 or a Fokker, and you'll possibly get a command after 2 years, or within 2 years. And I thought, wow, because in TAA, you'd have to wait 10 to 20 years to get the command. So I said, right, I'm on. So we're all in a big room, all the new recruits, and we're addressed by one of the management pilots of TAA, and he said, right, this half of the room's going to fly the DC-3 and this half's going to fly F-27s. And I'm right in the middle, and I've always thought DC-3, so I moved across to the DC-3 side and I got on the DC-3. So I went through the school, did the course, did the base training at Essendon Airport, got qualified, and then once I qualified, the airline was starting in September. So they said, right, when can you get to Port Moresby? And I said, well, I'm getting married on the 23rd of September. And they said, okay, so can you make it on the 24th? And I said, yeah. So he gave me, I said, I'm going to take the bride with me. So he gave me 2 tickets, one for me, first class in TAA, and I didn't have to cheat. And so we got married, stayed at the Travelodge at Melbourne Airport, and then we jumped on the burner and we went up to Port Moresby. So when we got there, we get out with our 2 suitcases and the sewing machine, and there's nobody to greet us, and it smelled, it was hot, it had a tin shed and a concrete floor, it was, you know, pretty agricultural. So the wife sitting on the suitcase, she said, what are we going to do now? And I said, I don't know, I'll go and find the Air New Guinea chief pilot. So I go out and I found where his office is. His name was Dick Glassy. Don't know if you heard of him, but he's a Kiwi. He's dead now. But anyway, I go into his office and here he is. He's really stressed because he's just started a brand new airline with a whole lot of recruits, got to do line training. We had all these TA and Ansett pilots doing our line training for us. So he said, right, well, you better come back tomorrow and we'll sort out your line training program. And I said, we've got nowhere to sleep. And he said, well, yeah, well, all the hotels are full. And I said, well, hang on, what are we going to do, sleep at the airport? And he said, oh, hang on. And he made a few phone calls and he said, right, I've got your room at the Barocco Hotel. I had no idea where it was or what it was. And he said, there's a bus, one of our buses down there. Right now it'll take you up there. So I went down and introduced myself to the driver, who was black as could be, and you know, he was chewing boo-eye, beetle nut, and he took us to the Barocco Hotel. What a shithole. Seriously, it was full of people drinking as hard as they go, all natives, you know, Papua New Guineans. The bar had bars on it to protect the barman. And you had to check into the barman. So I went and said, excuse me, I said, Air New Guinea, Mr. Wake, and he said, I said, I've got a room here. And he said, oh yeah, he said, it's room 6. He gave me this key, go up the stairs. So we get our 2 suitcases, the sewing machine and the wife, and we went upstairs, opened number 6, it's only got a single bed. And I thought, hang on. And the wife's saying, you know, things aren't looking too pretty at the moment, are they? And I said, no. So I go back to the barman and I said, look, we need a room with a double bed. And he said, there's none, mate. You've got the only room. So we slept in that room for 3 days. And I was about to quit and go home. But anyway, finally a bus came round. They said, right, we've got you an apartment. So he took us to the back streets of Barocco and he rocked us up at this apartment in which lived a mechanic who was going finished to Australia. And in the lounge room was a Holden engine. And I said, what happens to that? And he said, one of my mates will pick that up. And he said, but I've left you some food in the fridge. And I said, oh, good, because we've got no car. So anyway, I opened the fridge and here's a can of baked beans with mould in it. It had been open forever. And there was some milk that you wouldn't touch, a loaf of bread with 4 slices in the crust, and they were rock hard. So I'm trying to placate my new bride. I said, I will walk into town and get some food. So I actually walked into town, got some food, came back. Meantime, she'd thrown everything out of the fridge, started cleaning the place. Sheets, she had to wash them. So they were in the washing machine. Anyway, we lived there and I did my training in the DC-3, the line training, and we flew to all sorts of exotic places. DC-3 is limited to 10,000 feet because it's not pressurised, except some of the guys cheated if they had to, you know, because the pilots had oxygen. And the fact that you got a plane load of dead passengers didn't really matter as long as they, you know. Anyway, so we, it was terrific. I flew all over the place, you know, Lae, Goroka, Madang, Mount Hagen, all these exotic places in the mountains. And then one day we went to Rabaul. And just looking down it from the air, I thought, this is gorgeous. Now I've got to see if I can work this thing and show you Rabaul. It was just gorgeous. Oh no, before I go, Papua New Guinea, the reason so many pilots die in the place, it's pretty rugged terrain, you know, great mountains. This is a place called Tarpini Airport, and as you can see, it's a bit of a hill. And to go and land there, it's a bit tricky because you got to go down this kind of a glide slope. It's not a glide slope, it's a path that people use that they've worn over the years, and you turn left and you land on this. As soon as you land, you put the power on and get up the top. And so that's it again, a different view. And the Australian Air Force kindly donated a caribou years ago. They had a bit of an accident on landing. So that caribou was used as housing. There were people living in it. And, you know, it was pretty comfy. It had a few seats. Anyway, so finally, Rabaul. Where are we? There's the DC-3. That's Rabaul. Rabaul is right at the tip of New Britain, which is one of the islands of New Guinea. And the harbour is a caldera. It was an ancient volcano. All around the harbour are other volcanoes, and you can see there, that little fella there is the one that causes all the damage. It blows up about every 20 years, or 30 years or something, but it blew up in 1936 and really made a mess of the place. And the other volcanoes are kind of dormant, but that little fella there, and there's another one on the other side of the harbour that is also still active. Anyway, that's the town. I'll just show you the airport. There's the airport, and you can see it's pointed straight at that little volcano. So when you blast off, you've got to turn right, and you can do a circling approach from inside the caldera. It's got a golf course. You can see the golf course there. Does this show up? Yeah. Anyway, so Rabaul was a pretty nice town. It had 2 department stores, a supermarket, it had a couple of banks. It was really civilised. It had a big median strip down the middle of the main street, and the median strip had palm trees, and in between the palm trees, and I'd never seen one of these before, but there was marijuana bushes. And they'd been there for years until the cops figured out, somebody said, they're marijuana, and the cops said, what? So they pulled them all out, much to the disgust of most of the town. You know? But anyway, Rabaul was a pretty pleasant place. Now, it's New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, right? Papua is the southern part of New Guinea. New Guinea is the northern part. The northern part, Rabaul, was the first settlement in the 1880s, and they were German settlers. They came in and they set up coconut plantations, and the Germans actually administered New Guinea until the end of the First World War, when they lost and the British won. So they lost their New Guinea colonies, and Australia was given the job of administering the colonies, which they did until independence in 1974 or 5 or something. Anyway, so yeah, and then the war came, and the Japanese overran New Guinea, and they used Rabaul as their headquarters. And Rabaul was, that's where Admiral Yamamoto was there, and he ran the war, the Japanese war in the Pacific, Navy, and apparently he was quite a nice bloke. he was very fair, and he tried to talk him out of Pearl Harbor, which didn't work. Anyway, so he was there, and he had in the middle of town there was a bunker, underground bunker, that was his office, and on the ceiling was a huge map of the Pacific. So he used to plan his, his operations from there. During the war, Australia had these soldiers in the jungle called coast watchers. You might have heard of them, and they had a radio. They had native helpers to carry this thing, and they'd make radio reports of the Japanese movements and send it back to either the Americans or the Australians. And anyway, they observed Yamamoto every 2 weeks would go down to Honiara, capital of the Solomon Islands, to go and, do a rah-rah talk to them or help them with their war. And so the Coast Watchers pinpointed this, and it was pretty regular, so they told the Americans, and they came over and they shot him down. And he got killed, 1943. And I'll just show you a picture of, hang on. Wait a minute. Oh, that's a couple of things that popped up in the harbour during the 1936 volcano, and they're still there. Right, now this is the wreckage of Yamamoto's aeroplane. And the little celebration going on there, or it's not a celebration, it's a memorial service for the 75th anniversary of his death. So that was 2013. So the Japanese fellow on the left, and so they had a gathering of mainly Japanese people, and they did this little ceremony. And Rabaul actually had a whole lot of wrecked aeroplanes, mainly Japanese. There's one there, that was just beside the airport. There were aeroplanes all over the place. In the harbour were sunken merchantman ships, and we used to scuba dive on them. And these ships, when the Americans hit them, because they came over in their B-24s, I think, and they bombed these ships, and when they went to the bottom, that's where they were. And when we dived on them, there was ordnance all over the decks because they were unloading ordnance. And when the ordnance crashed back down, boom, and there's machine gun shells, anti-aircraft, all sorts of stuff all over the decks. And we're advised not to touch them because any bubbles that came out of it were nitroglycerin. And they said, don't move the ordnance. Well, some of us did, but we didn't get blown up, luckily. So anyway, that's typical of stuff lying around the place. All right, so where do we go next? There's the old Fokker Friendship. That's taken off out of Rabaul Airport. And the Fokker was terrific. We used to go all over the place in the Fokker. The best trips were down to the Solomon Islands via Rabaul, Buka, Kieta, and then Honiara. And we would fly it below 500 feet, which was not allowed, and along the beach. And the passengers loved it because they're looking out at beautiful beaches, plantations, coral, and volcanoes. And the volcanoes were smoking. I just had another bit of a story and I've forgotten it, which happens because I'm an old fart. Yeah, hang on. Yeah, I'm just trying to... No, I can't think of it. Anyway, it was a good story, but I can't think of it.
Not about the bomb scare?
Hey?
Bomb scare?
Oh, yeah, well, I did get a bomb scare. Yeah. I got a... we had a bomb scare. In Rabaul was a bloke called Jack Chipper. And Jack Chipper, he used to deal in scrap metal, and he used to get divers up to get the props off the ships. And we called him Hydraulic Jack because he could lift anything. And he was a really scruffy, he wasn't a very nice bloke. And one day in Moresby, he was supposed to get on my flight to go back to Rabaul, and he wasn't on it. He was in talking to his mates in the terminal. And we had the engines running, we're about to go, and he comes out and he's like this in front, and we go, so we shut him down, and this bloke, he went and opened the door just as the police arrived, and they took him away. And he was most incensed, The next week, same flight, we got a bomb scare. They called us up and they said, we've got a specific bomb scare. There's specific or non-specific. They said, this is specific. Park it over there the bomb people are coming. And so they arrived and they got in. And I said to him, look, you don't need us here, do we? And he said, no. And I said, can we go? And he said, yes. So I got my overnight bag and I dropped it on the tarmac and the alarm clock went off. Well, should have seen the bomb people. They were scared. And one bloke went up and over a barbed wire fence, or it had barbed wire at the top, you know. And anyway, I said, look, it's just an alarm clock. And I pulled it out and I had guns on me. And anyway, we survived that one. But it was that guy that did that to me. I tell you, yeah, this is a story I'm trying to tell you. This is quite funny. There was an old, we used to go to Aviation, which is about 40 minutes out of Rabaul. Aviation's a main town in New Ireland to the northwest. And we'd overnight there in this horrible pub, the Aviation Hotel. And anyway, there was a little old native fella who'd come out every Friday night and he's got boxes of mud crabs and they're all tied up. Anyway, came out this Saturday morning and he said, Master, me spark too much. It means he got drunk. And I said, so? And he said, have a look. So we look in and they're not tied up and there's crabs doing this in these big, very strong cardboard boxes. And I said, they'll be all right. Put them on. So they put them on. Anyway, we took off and we're about 20 minutes into our flight and one of the girls comes up and says, have a look down the back. And there's bloody mud crabs coming down the aisle, snapping at people. They're all standing on the seats. And I said, folks, you got to sit down for the landing. They said, no. So they sat on standing or sitting on the seats, you know, with their legs up. And there's crabs everywhere. Anyway, then the cargo boys had to clean all the crabs out. And then we had to take it down to Port Moresby. So we blast off out of Rabaul for Port Moresby, and they didn't get all the crabs, did they? So there's more crabs coming out of the woodwork. So these are the colourful things that happened in Papua New Guinea. It really was a very colourful place. I got in the Fokker once, we're going to Goroka, and a bloke steps up in the cockpit. He's got a bone in the nose, he's got feathers, and he's got a grass skirt, and he's got a machete. And I go, what do you want? And he said, take me to Goroka. And I said, okay, we will. You sit down, because we're going there anyway. So he went and sat down, and then when we landed, as he's getting out, I said, you happy now? He said, oh, thank you. And he got out, you know. Okay, so then Air Niugini got ambitious and they wanted to go international. So they bought some 707s from Qantas. So there we are, 707. And so we had to learn to fly these things. So they sent us down to Sydney to Qantas training to learn how to fly them. So we did the ground school and we did the simulator. And the simulator in those days was pretty basic gadget, you know, not like the simulators now that are just brilliant. And Qantas had the attitude that if you weren't a Qantas pilot, how could you possibly know how to fly an aeroplane? Well, we just proved that you don't have to be a Qantas pilot, you know. All of our guys except 2 got through. And so we had, I started off as a first officer, and within 2 years I did training for a captain. My training captain was a Kiwi ex-Air Force bloke who Ken might remember. His name was Alan Durwood. Does that ring a bell?
Sure does.
Anyway, he did my training on the 707. He was a real gentleman. He was a lovely guy. Others had English trainers, and these English guys were ex-RAF and ex-Royal Navy, and they were just pedantic bunch of people. Anyway, so we got through our training, and then we branched out around the Pacific, and we had Brisbane, Sydney, Auckland, Honolulu. Why, I don't know, because we'd only have about half a dozen passengers each way. We went to Manila, Hong Kong, Singapore, Jakarta, and we did charters. So it was pretty good. Honolulu was the big one, and you had to carry an air navigator, you know, a flight navigator in the 707, because our inertial nav system was new, and the department in Australia said, no, we want you to take a navigator just to make sure everything's going to work. And the 707 has a hole in the roof, and that's about that big. Yep. It has a flap, and you have to open the flap, and the navigator put a periscopic sextant up there and to do his star shots. And then he'd sit down at his table and do his sums. And every time he came up with a position and a heading, our inertial system matched his. He was brilliant. To me, it was fantasy and science fiction, astro navigation. He was terrific. And he got us out of trouble more than once. And the other thing is, going to Honolulu at night, that's when, and the other thing, the girls used to come in, and they only did it once, because then he got really, cranky, but they put mascara around his eyepiece. So he's up there and he's doing his thing, and then he sits down and having his cup of coffee, and you'd look around and go, and he'd say, "What's so funny?" I said, "Nothing." Anyway, eventually he said, "Oh, back in a minute, got to go to the toilet." So then he comes back and says, "You bastards." I said, "We didn't do it." Because he had the big ring around his eye. Anyway, so that was that. And the other thing is, we had no movies in those days. And coming back from Honolulu was a daytime flight. So all the passengers down the back, either getting drunk, reading, talking, sleeping, whatever. And I used to make an announcement crossing the line. And I said, one day I said, "Oh, folks, we're going to cross the equator in about 5 minutes. And when we do, you'll feel a slight bump and the aeroplane will accelerate because it's going downhill." And my first officer looked at me and said, "You idiot." And I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, I bet some of them believe it." And he said, "Oh, come on." Anyway, as we crossed the line, I go bang on the control column. The aeroplane goes boom. And next minute, this American comes up. He wants to come up to the cockpit. So he said, "Yeah, bring him in." He comes in. He said, "God damn," he says, "I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't feel it." And I said, "What?" He said, "The bump. I felt the bump." And I said, "Yeah, did you look out the window?" And he said, "What's out the window?" I said, "There's a line on the sea." And he said, "You got to be kidding." I said, "Yeah, there's no line, but there is a bump." And he said, "I know, I felt it." You got away with that. Yeah, so, that was a bit of fun. We did charters in these things, and we used to, the Fiji government had a contract with the United Nations to supply troops to the southern peacekeeping zone in Lebanon. So we got the job of taking them out of Suba. So we'd go Suba, Moresby, Singapore, Bahrain, Beirut. And that was pretty exciting. These soldiers are big guys, and most of them wanted to smoke. So the girls said they want to smoke. I said, "Let them. It's their aeroplane." So, because you weren't allowed to smoke, but we said, "Yep, they can smoke." And they were such gentlemen. They were such nice people. We got stuck in Beirut once because we had a broken starter motor on the Boeing. And so we had 2 engineers with us. So we went and stayed in town. We weren't allowed out of the hotel. Top 2 floors were missing because the Israelis had wiped them out with rockets. And while we were there, I remember a couple of buildings going up. It was a bit dangerous. We weren't allowed out in case we got shot. So we stayed in, and the engineers, pardon me, they robbed a starter motor from a Cyprus Airlines 707 that had a great hole through the middle of it. Don't be alarmed, it's just a cough. And they overnight they put the starter motor on and they got us going again. So, it was terrific. And and what was the other story? We had a 707 we had to pick up in Tel Aviv. It was having work done by the Israeli aircraft company. And they were doing renovations, maintenance, all sorts of things to this aeroplane. And to get it out of Israel back to Sydney, which was where we had to take it, you had to go through all this Arab territory. And it was just when the Iranians had their revolution, their Islamic revolution. And our Clive, our navigator, he managed to get us a clearance. He said, "What we're going to do, we're going to go to Larnaca in Cyprus, and we're going to overnight there and pretend that's where we started." And the best he could do, he got a clearance to go through through Iran, right in the middle of their revolution, and down over Pakistan.
Could you move back a little bit closer to the desk, sorry? Yep, that'll be fine.
Is this thing actually working?
No, but,
Is it?
No.
Because I can't seem to hear. Anyway, so we got this clearance to go over Iran. We had to go right up over Tehran turn right and head down towards Pakistan, and we crossed the border, I think, at a place called Isfahan. And when we go into the Pakistani airspace, Clive had been trying to get a clearance through Pakistan, no response. And he said, bugger, let's do it anyway. So we get into their airspace, and we called Karachi Control, and they said, oh, and we had a Belgian registration, Oscar, Oscar, Yankee, Charlie Lima. Oscar, Oscar, Yankee, Charlie Lima. You cannot cross Pakistan. And we said, well, we tried to get a clearance, couldn't get one. And they said, well, you haven't got a clearance, so you must land at Karachi. And we said, oh, okay. So we had no charts, so we got their runway directions, their frequencies and stuff, and we landed at Karachi. And the first guy into the aeroplane he looked like he was 15 years old with an AK-47. He said, welcome to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. We said, oh, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much. And we said, we need to see somebody about our clearance. So they had a mini moke, towed the fueling equipment out. They detached the moke. So we had this captain, the Clyde Oliphant, the navigator, and our flying clerk, who had a bag full of money. And they went to the office, and there's two generals, and they said, oh, welcome to Pakistan. And we said, thank you so much. And they said, would you like a cup of tea? Yes, thank you. Oh, please sit down. And we said, we haven't got a clearance. We've tried to get one. And they said, but now we have a clearance for you. And we said, oh, thank you. And he gave us this bit of paper. He said, there's your clearance. And we said, thank you so much. We'll finish our tea and be off. But the clearance cost 4,000 American dollars. So our flying clerk, he opens his bag and comes out with $4,000. They divided it into two and they put it in their pockets. And they said, thank you very much. Now you can go. And they said, don't forget, you must buy some fuel. And so we had to buy a bit of fuel. We got 5,000 pounds of fuel in cash. We paid it with cash. So we got our fuel and then we blast off, went to Singapore and finally to Sydney. Yeah, anyway. Hey, just one other thing about the 707. When we used to go to Honolulu, we could get a blanket clearance between 330 to 370. You could do anything in between, provided you ended up at 370 at a certain point. And we used to fly the old 70 at min-cost cruise, which was Mach 0.82. And as the speed built up, we'd go up another 200 feet and set Mach 0.82 with this specific power setting on the EPA gauge. EPA's engine pressure ratio, and that's how they measured the power, because the intake and the outtake, there's a pressure ratio. They go at one end and out the other. And so we'd set it up with this specific power setting, and we made about 5,000-6,000 pounds of fuel just on that flight doing that, and the company loved us for it. Anyway, that's just another little aside. Anyway, in New Guinea, they got their money's worth out of their 707s, and then they decided to get into more modern aeroplanes. So they went and, hang on, just one thing first. There's me having dinner, and I had hair then. On the old 70. The meals weren't too bad. I used to know the chef, good mate of ours, the chief cook, and he'd ring up and say, oh, what do you want for lunch going to Singapore? And I say, oh, usual mashed potato, sausages, mashed potato and peas. And he said, yeah, done. And I said, what do you want? And he said, I've got a mate trying to get there and there's no seats. And I said, wrong, cockpit seat. So we used to trade food for seats. Right, what's next? Oh, yeah, the cockpit of the 70. Hang on. There it is. So we had a flight engineer. Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Yeah, so we had a flight engineer. That's the flight engineer's panel on the right. And I know there's people here who know exactly what that is. And but the flight engineer did engines, fuel, air conditioning, and the electrical power, where the blokes in the front just flew it. And he had a chair right there. That when on takeoff, he would slide it back and forward. So when you do a takeoff, you would push the power up and he would lean forward and set it to the power setting for takeoff. And we had this cheeky engineer, an English guy, and he used to call himself the buggy driver. And so the visitors in the cockpit, they'd say, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm the buggy driver." And they said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I'm sitting behind two arseholes." Yeah, anyway, that's the old 7.0. It's very dear to my heart. I've got a lot of hours in that. Right, and then they decided to get Airbus. So Airbus A310. So off we go to Paris, to Toulouse, to learn to fly the Airbus. And they got contract blokes in from America to fly the 707s while we're away. And it was like going on holidays. We're getting a bucket load of money, daily allowances. We were given a car each to go to and from work. And it was just fantastic. You know, the food, the bars, it was fantastic. And so we did our course in Toulouse. We had so much fun, we almost forgot to do the course. You know, we used to go to the historic villages around the place, and it was just great. We loved the south of France, and we also loved this aeroplane. Now, that aeroplane was one of the first, along with the 767, that didn't need a flight engineer. So everything was automatic. The pilots would set everything, put all the fuel pumps on and do everything overhead and sit back, and the aeroplane would operate itself. All we had to do was fly it, you know. So it was a really good aeroplane. Anyway, then I'd got enough hours, and Singapore Airlines were looking for pilots. And they'd just taken a whole lot of Australian pilots, because these stupid Australians, they all resigned in 1988. So here's all these guys with lots of money because they got paid out, and they didn't have jobs. So they ended up in Singapore flying A310s, 777s, the 744, 7400, and they still needed pilots. So I applied to Singapore, went there, did the sim ride, did the medical, did the interviews, got the job. So I got trained on the 747, which I absolutely loved. It was the only thing about the 747 is that the takeoff was fun, the landing was generally challenging, but the bit in the middle was frickin' boring, you know. But it was just a wonderful aeroplane. At the, you know, if you did more than 8 hours, there were more than 2 pilots. There were 3 or 4, and we had a bunk room at the back of the cockpit with double bunk. So you actually put your jammies on, go to the toilet, clean your teeth, and go to bed. And you would go to sleep, and then they'd wake you up 6 hours later and say, "Righto, your turn." So you'd get in and finish the flight. So they had, sometimes back when I was there, they had 2 crews, pilot and first officer, pilot and first officer. There was a command crew who did the takeoff and the landing, and the in-flight relief crew. So it was a very civilised life. We went to all sorts of places. You get the roster and look at it and say, "Whoa, where's that?" And I remember one was, it said Antananarivo. Does anybody know where that is? It was the capital of Madagascar, and I had to fly a freighter there. And so when I found out where it was on Google, then I had to go in and do this little instruction video on, you know, how to manage going into Antananarivo. We used to go to Mauritius. Oh, you know, then from there to Johannesburg, try not to get killed by the locals. But yeah, we had some terrific destinations. I used to love going to Europe. I particularly love going to Heathrow because we, you know, had mates in England, and I'd go and stay with them. And I used to call them, you know, there's this lady, we met them in Singapore, and I rang her up on sat phone over Lake Baikal. And she said, "Oh, is that you, Wider?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Are you coming here?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh God, I suppose you want a bed." And I said, "Yeah." "Oh, okay. Well, I'll pick you up at the airport." And hung up, and the first officer looked at me and he said, "Is that your girlfriend?" And I said, anyway, while I was waiting for her, I could see he was in the lobby, sort of hiding behind a palm tree, watching to see what my girlfriend looked like. Finally, up comes this little old lady in a Ford Fiesta. She says, "Hello, Whitey, get in." Yeah. And when I called her, I said, she said, where are you? And I said, we're over Lake Baikal. And she said, where the f***'s that? And I said, oh, it's far east in Russia. Oh, God. Anyway, I loved going to the UK. And I loved the 747. So that's about, I don't know, about all I can say about it. Except it was here's its cockpit, which it was very automatic. You know, you could they'd say, oh, we want you to descend to 3,000 feet, turn left heading 250, and slow up to 250 knots. So you go 250, 250, 3,000, click, 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 and sit back and watch it all happen. You know, it was such an easy aeroplane to fly. I really reckon I could teach anybody to fly it. It was lovely, and even landing it, you know, because the voice call out on the way down, it says 100, you know, it's a big deep voice, 100, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. That's your height above the ground. When you hear 10, just power off and just wait and do a double E landing. And there you are on the ground. But if it goes 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, bang, you know, you've got to be a bit careful. Yeah, okay. Now, you've probably heard about the IGS approach into Hong Kong. Whoops, hang on. Just go back a bit. It was a very challenging approach. Have I got it? Yeah, there it is. Now that is the Jeppesen chart for the IGS. It means Instrument Guidance System. Now an ILS, which we probably all know, ILS means that if the needle's in the middle in the cockpit, means you're on the centre line. If the needle is in the middle, the horizontal needle, it means you're on the glide path, which means you're going down at 3 degrees. So this has an ILS, but it goes into a hill with a checkerboard. And when you get visual, you've got to do a right turn. But anyway, I'll just explain. You start off here at 4,000 feet over this Chung Chau, and then I think you let down to about 3,000, heading out 270, 7 miles out. You start a right turn and you intercept the IGS. So once again, it's got a centre line and a glide slope, and you follow the IGS down towards the hill, which if you don't change anything, you'll hit the hill. And and when you get visual, I think the minimum, I can't quite remember. What about Ken? Do you remember? I think it was 700. Sorry?
It's around about 700.
Yeah, something like that. But if you weren't visual, you had to do a go-round, which means you put the power on and off you go, and you turn right and you head down on the runway direction to go round. But if you're visual, and generally you were, and sometimes you're visual from way back, you can see it, and you look to the right and there's the airport. So this is where you have to disconnect the autopilot and the autothrottle and manually fly it. And it wasn't really challenging for us, you know, because we got trained really well by the Qantas blokes, and you have to turn right, continue descending, keep looking at for the VASI lights or the lights, you know, on the runway threshold, and when you finish the turn, you should be heading for the threshold. Once you've got the turn finished, which was about 300 feet, does that sound right, Ken? About there. And we always reckoned if we were on time, we could see this Chinese chick having a shower, because you're down there almost amongst the buildings, you know. And it was a very exciting approach, and it was challenging, but like I said, we're well trained and we handled it quite well, as most pilots did. Now, Kai Tak had been there since I think 1952 or 3 or something, and they closed it down in 1988. And over all those years, they had a few accidents, but not many. And I don't think anybody got killed, you know. So, yeah, and it was one of those places you had to be trained, and if you weren't trained, it was a little bit chaotic. Right, I'm just looking to see the next one. Yeah, so there's the checkerboard with an aeroplane doing the turn to line up, and it was about a 30-degree turn. That's what it looks like from down in Kowloon City when the aeroplanes are on short final for the runway. That's one that didn't make it. China Airlines, they overshot the runway and ended up in the water. And once again, the people didn't even get their feet wet. They walked along the wing and got onto dry ground. and they had to cut the tail off that to keep the runway active. So, yeah. And then, when you turn 60, he had to quit. And I hated quitting, but, and then soon after that, they made it 65. And when you turn 60 in Singapore, on your last flight, management pilots come out and they meet you and they get your tie and they cut it off. And you think, oh, well, I guess I'm out of here. And one of my mates, he's always grizzling, he's the biggest whinger, he's always unwell, you know, he said, oh, I haven't been well. So poor old David, why don't you shoot yourself? Anyway, his last flight, they had him, he was flying the 777 and he was supposed to go Taipei to LA, and he goes into ops and he said, look, I haven't been well. He got me this huge flight from the last flight. Haven't you got anything shorter? And they said, oh, we'll work on it. So he goes home and then they ring him up and they said, right, how does KL return sound? And he said, oh, that'll be just great. So he went and did his KL return, and his last flight was landing back in Singapore, got out of the aeroplane, went home. Now, the flight that he was supposed to do, it hadn't caught up with the management, and they were meeting that flight as it came back in from Taipei, and as the pilot got off, the captain, they said, Captain, congratulations, Captain Woolfall, and they cut his tie off. And he says, what? I'm not Captain Woolfall. He said, what are you doing? Am I sacked? And they said, oh, we thought you were Captain Woolfall. He said, no. And so this poor guy thought he'd, you know, been sacked. That's how you left Singapore, with half a tie. Right, so anyway, regrettably I quit and we went home. We had a little farm just out of, in northern New South Wales, a place called Bangalow, and we thought, oh, we'll get on big farmers. But then I thought, you know what, I haven't finished yet. So I got onto CAFA and I got a job up there instructing simulator, 744 simulator, and it was great. I really loved it. And it went for 3 years, but I found that getting up at midnight to go and do a 4-hour shift wasn't much fun. So when my contract came up after 3 years, I quit. And that was it. So that was the end of my flying career. And I really enjoyed it. It was colourful, did a lot of things. Most pilots join the airline and they live their whole life in the airline and come out the other end without having done half the things that I did, you know. Anyway, look, thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Well done.